The most virulent opposition to public housing in Chicago came from white working-class families who felt trapped in the racially changing city. With the flow of migrants from the South surging after the Second World War, realtors used shady block-busting tactics, surreptitiously moving a single black family into an area, then drumming up fears among white neighbors of decreasing property values and a growing threat of crime to buy up their houses on the cheap. Many white Chicagoans took advantage of the new federally insured mortgages to speed out to all white suburbs. Those who couldn't afford to move were desperate to preserve whatever tenuous hold they had on their neighborhoods. Their parents or grandparents had come to Chicago from Europe, and they made a home in the city, buying a bungalow among families much like themselves. They believed all of that was now in jeopardy. There were nearly 500 outbreaks of interracial violence in Chicago between 1945 and 1950, with 350 of them directly tied to fights over housing. At the CHA's airport homes near Midway Airport on the west side, white residents from the neighborhood vandalized the public housing development in 1946 at the mere rumor that black World War II veterans might be allowed to live there. Several men strong-armed their way into the housing office, stole keys, and moved white families into vacant units. When the CHA did rent one of the subsidized apartments to a black family weeks later, the husband was a decorated veteran, one of the 175,000 returning from the war who applied for government housing assistance in Chicago, and he was selected as carefully for the occasion as Jackie Robinson was for his integration of Major League Baseball the following spring. As a precaution, the CHA brought in the family during the day when most men from the community were away at work. But white women took up the charge, hurling curses and dirt and bricks. Similar protests occurred the following summer when the CHA tried to integrate the Fernwood homes, except that the mobs in the Southside neighborhood of Roseland were even larger, reaching 5,000. White youth pulled black drivers from passing cars and beat them. Local churches and community groups endorsed the violence that continued for weeks, and the neighborhood's aldermen condemned not the perpetrators, but the CHA for including Roseland in these, quote, ideological experiments, end quote. The largest of the city's public housing race riots occurred at the Trumbo homes in the Southside neighborhood of South Deering. In 1953, a light-skinned black woman applied for a public housing unit in Chicago, and the housing authority, assuming she was white, accidentally integrated the development of 3-story apartment buildings and row homes. South Deering was a working-class area of Italians, Poles, and Slavs, south of the encroaching Black Belt, but north of all black Alt-Ged gardens, separated from it by Lake Calumet and the surrounding steel mills. When the woman showed up with her husband and children, the resulting protests lasted for months, with locals setting off homemade bombs and crowds burning down businesses. A community newspaper wrote about the, quote, savage, lustful, immoral standards of the Southern Negro, end quote, submitting that South Deering might consider accepting black residents only after black people were civilized. In the meantime, the white neighborhood would defend itself while other, quote, spineless communities, end quote, were, quote, raped, robbed, and murdered, end quote. In 1947, amid the ongoing racial upheaval, the city's Democratic machine forced out Mayor Edward Kelly. Kelly had allowed Elizabeth Wood to keep the CHA free of the machine's patronage hires and preferential contracts, and he tolerated an agency agenda often at odds with the interests of local ward bosses. The new mayor, Martin Connelly, was picked by the regular Democratic organization because he could be counted on by the city's power brokers. Some progressive housing reformers at that time believed it was preferable to build new public housing on vacant land on the outskirts of the city, where the net gain of homes would be greatest and the poor could start anew. Others insisted on building atop existing slums, so the city's most deplorable housing would be replaced. Elizabeth Wood and Robert Taylor wanted to spread around new sites, apportioning the working poor across a number of different neighborhoods so that the entire city shouldered the responsibility of housing the disadvantaged. But under Connelly, the city council was given the final say on the selection of public housing sites. Spurred on by the racial fears of their constituents, aldermen rejected every site proposed by the CHA that was in a white neighborhood. When the council debated the issue for 4 consecutive days in 1950, hundreds of residents from white areas were bussed in to fill the gallery. Of the 12,500 new units to go up in Chicago, just 2,000 of them will be constructed on empty land. The remaining 10,500 were built in black slums or as extensions of existing public housing developments. The CHA reluctantly accepted these terms. Any housing was deemed better than further delays or no new homes at all. And so I want to take a moment to reflect on a couple of the things we read there. It has been documented that stacking poverty on top of poverty does not solve poverty, does not fix poverty. And that is what was going on here, is that the wisest option, the most humane option, the most intelligent option would have been to spread these public housings around the city, to build them on areas of land that did not already have things on them, and like was pointed out in here, for the whole city to shoulder these people who were disadvantaged. And instead of doing that, because the people who were disadvantaged were disproportionately black and were specifically disproportionately black and of color, and that cannot be understated, or that cannot be overstated, they did not want that to happen. They wanted to only have the black people continue to be in the areas where black people were already at. And so the areas that black people are already at, we've already went through in the beginning passages of this book, and it's been pointed out the substandard conditions that existed there. It's been pointed out the exploitation and the discrimination and things of that nature that existed there. And so we see here that the political system, the political party, the businessmen decided to stack poverty on top of poverty, to not have the city shoulder the responsibility of and the accountability of helping the constituents who were living in substandard housing conditions. And they just, again, they stack poverty on top of poverty. And so it's not a coincidence, as we were going through the early parts of this book, you can see the blatant mistakes that were made. And, I hesitate to use the word mistakes because these things were done purposeful. These things were done because the people who were going to deal with the negative aspects of these decisions were people that they did not care about. And so when you just look at a timeline of where we're at, when you think of slavery ending in the slavery existing for hundreds of years, then in the mid 1800s, slavery ending, and then from the mid late 1800s, slavery ending, and then from that mid to late 1800s of slavery ending, black people were disproportionately in the South, and while they were in the South, they dealt with black codes and black laws, which meant that if you didn't have a job or if you didn't have a home, you could be arrested and thrown in jail. Once in jail, you would become part of a chain gang. The jails in the South have begun to have convict leasing. So black people were being arrested and jailed and then basically being enslaved again, sometimes in worse conditions than they were before. There were black people who were sharecropping and being heavily exploited from sharecropping. And then this is, around the time that Reconstruction is happening. But then when you get towards the very end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, you see the destruction of Reconstruction. You see the rise of white supremacists and white vigilante terrorism and Jim Crow segregation in the South. And so black people flee those areas, flee these lands, and come to the Midwest, come to the West Coast. And then once in the Midwest and the West Coast, they live with substandard housing conditions. They live with exploitative working conditions. They live with discrimination in their living conditions. And when laws begin to be signed and opportunities begin to be had for people of working class status to escape some of these substandard living conditions, to escape some of these negative aspects that existed in these cities, black people were pushed to the back of the line. And anytime black people tried to take advantage of these opportunities, there were violent uprisings, violent protests, violent demonstrations that racist white people took part in an effort to continue to subjugate and marginalize black people, to not allow black people to rise up any further. And that brings us to the 1940s, 1950s. And so you see how from the moment that the first set of African slaves were brought onto this land up to 1950, there has not been a consistent point in time where black people had the opportunity to experience the American dream en masse. And then the few who were able to slip through the cracks still had to deal still had to deal with violent racism. And for what it's worth, I think it's important to point out that these actions, these racist ideologies were being espoused and were being acted upon by members of the Democratic Party. And when you speak about the type of racism that exists in Chicago, the type of racism that exists in Illinois, I think, again, that's the thing to be pointed out, that we are reading about specifically the ideology and the thought process of people who lived in Illinois, of white people in Illinois. And we see here that just simply because they're Democrats did not make them not racist. And that same thing that existed in 1950 exists in 2021. Simply being a Democrat does not mean that you are not racist, that you are not acting upon racist ideology. Okay. From that point on, the agency no longer bothered to suggest sites for its developments beyond existing ghettos. Robert Taylor, humbled, resigned. And while Wood stayed on until 1954, when she was forced out, she had been stripped of her independence. Quote, "I was so undercut politically that I was feeble. I was floundering around," end quote, she said later. Quote, "We no longer had power to select where the projects were going to go, and we had very little space to work with, so we had to go to the high-rises," end quote. Of the 33 housing projects built in Chicago in the coming 2 decades, a total of 168 high-rise buildings, all save one went up in an overwhelmingly black neighborhood or an area far along in its transition from white to black. Public housing still represented a major upgrade for families in these decaying neighborhoods. Yet large public housing complexes now had the effect of solidifying the boundaries between black and white Chicago in superblocks detached from the street grid and in towers of concrete and steel. In Arnold Hirsch's history of this pivotal reconfiguring of the city, the making of the second ghetto, he calls the site selection of Chicago's high-rise public housing a, quote, "domestic containment policy," end quote. Wood complained at a public forum soon after her firing, quote, "It is the will of politicians to keep Negroes where they are," end quote. And there's a pastor from Rockford, Illinois. His name's Pastor Shelby. He gave a speech that I've heard multiple times at city council meetings in Rockford, Illinois. And he spoke about how Rockford had a containment plan, how somebody wrote something. Somebody from the outside had came into Rockford, seen the things that were going on, and said that he believes what was going on in Rockford was a de facto containment plan to contain black people on the west side of the city. And so you see the same type of actions being done in Chicago, where they have this containment plan. They're trying to stuff all these public housings into black areas. They're what's the word I'm looking for? They're divesting from the areas that they're putting this public housing in. We've seen that take place, specifically pointed out here in the removal of an internship, an apprenticeship program that the union took away once black children started going to certain schools. And so we see how it's not, even though these public housings were new and were better conditions than these black people were living in before, we see how we see that the area and the neighborhoods that they are living in, that the resources are being pulled from them as black people are being put there. And we see that they're continuing to stack more and more black people in this area, continuing to stack more and more poverty in this area. And again, it should be pointed out that these black people that they're stacking and piling in this area are relegated to a life of second-class citizenship. They cannot go to the best of schools. They cannot get the best of jobs. They cannot get the highest of pay. And they're also traumatized people. These are people who, for generations, have dealt with the worst of the American society. And so you can see you can see how this was setting all of these people up for failure. Okay, so we're going to end this episode here, and then we're going to finish this chapter on the next episode. I want to encourage people to listen to Rockford Reading Daily podcast, whatever you listen to podcasts at. We have more episodes coming out in the future. If you haven't listened to previous episodes, please go back and listen to them. We've read Have Black Lives Ever Mattered, Race Matters, Citizens, Cops and Power, letter from Birmingham Jail, essay on civil disobedience, and then Women, Race, and Class. And now we are reading High Risers by Ben Austin. Thanks for taking out the time to listen to this, and we'll be back tomorrow with a new episode. All right, welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing reading High Risers by Ben Austin. We are going to pick up at the bottom of page 34 for anybody who may be reading along. When the Housing Act of 1937 was being debated, it was opposed by every real estate trade group, by builders, suppliers, U.S. Chambers of Commerce, property owners' associations, and the Departments of the Interior and the Treasury. 8 years earlier, the department store's scion, Marshall Field III, opened one of Chicago's first subsidized housing developments a couple of blocks north of the future Cabrini Row House site. The Marshall Field Garden Apartments included 628 low-income dwellings, as well as a progressive demonstration school, workrooms, and storefronts on the ground floor. But the entire complex was privately funded. The charity intended also to attract additional commercial and residential development to the surrounding Italian neighborhood. State-run housing was seen as something altogether different. Critics of the day denounced it as government overreach, with the handouts maligned as anti-capitalist, socialist, and generally un-American. A public housing development, the very idea of it, clashed with the country's exalted sense of home ownership, with the national ethos wrapped up in visions of the frontiersman, the log cabin, and the self-made entrepreneur. Although the subsidy was reserved only for stable families with modest incomes, the, quote, deserving poor, end quote, the ceiling on what residents could earn was said to discourage hard work, acting as a sap on initiative and pluck. Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead, from 1943, dramatized the backlash against Roosevelt's call for a deeper social contract of shared responsibility. The hero of the novel is an architect of a public housing complex who becomes outraged when he returns from a trip to discover that his bare-bones high-rise has been compromised to include, quote, the expense of incomprehensible features, end quote. Among what he deems non-essential aesthetics are blue-painted metal balconies. Quote, you got to give them a place to sit on in the fresh air, end quote, he's told. A gymnasium demanded by the social worker in charge of tenant selection, extra doorways and windows, an awning, decorative brickwork, and a carved relief sculpture above the building's main entrance. In an act that is portrayed as a valiant defense of his convictions, the architect dynamites the entire building. Like all the New Deal programs, public housing wasn't positioned as a renunciation for the Like all the New Deal programs, public housing wasn't positioned as a renunciation of the for-profit capitalist system. Instead, it was a massive government intervention meant to save it. Hiring under the Public Works Administration, relief for farmers, aid to senior citizens through Social Security, food stamps for the urban poor, and public housing, these reforms treated poverty not as a personal moral failing, but as a widespread social and economic injustice that the country was obligated to right. The programs were also intended to jumpstart the economy, creating jobs and resuscitating the industrial sector through large-scale civic construction projects. In 1949, Congress passed legislation that promised to fund 810,000 additional units of public housing. President Harry Truman, in signing the bill into law, declared that it was the nation's collective duty to provide a, quote, decent home and a suitable living environment for every American family, end quote. But it was voted into law only after being packaged as part of an expansive urban renewal bill that promised to revive cities and rebuild their infrastructure. In the House of Representatives, the last of several efforts to strip the bill of its public housing provisions came within 5 votes of passing. Catherine Bauer, the crusader who helped will the nation's public housing program into being, would regret that the subsidy was, quote, continuously controversial, not dead, but never more than half alive, end quote. The CHA, which campaigned to get 40,000 of the new public housing units built in Chicago, argued that modernizing the worst neighborhoods would not only benefit the poor, but also restore the city to profitability. Quote, a Chicago slum district costs the taxpayers 6 times as much annually as is paid back to the city in taxes, end quote, the agency advertised. The CHA estimated that it could build as many as 150,000 units of public housing without taking a single customer away from the standard private sector housing market. In a further appeal to self-interest, the agency added that quality low-rent homes would keep the poor from seeking better housing elsewhere, such as in your neighborhood. Maybe most tellingly, the same Depression-era legislation that funded the country's first public housing developments was also created federally insured private home loans. Also created the federally insured private home loan. With the Federal Housing Administration guarantee, banks were able to offer large home mortgages to people, paid off in small increments over an unprecedented 30 years, allowing families to put down as little as 10% of a house's cost. With this revolution in home financing, families could afford bigger and better homes, and developers and designers began to build homes in anticipation of the growing demand. The subsidies to the speculative real estate market dwarfed the outlays to public housing and to any programs offering rental assistance. Here was the American dream in practice. A select number of the nation's ill-housed got public housing in cities. Those better off were able to buy homes, increasingly in the suburbs, with the government taking on the risk. African Americans, who'd been owned as property as little more than 2 generations earlier, and then had their own property systematically taken away from them in the Jim Crow South, found themselves excluded from a gamed mortgage system that allowed others to accumulate wealth with little investment and with minimized risk. And so let's take a second here to reflect on that. I think the thing that is, and this was something I have begun to speak about as we were reading through these passages, because I have read a book that was the book Color of Law, which I probably refer to a lot of times as we're reading through this. They have some close connections and correlations with each other. But within that book, it also spoke about during the 20th century, during the 1900s, most of these things happen with housing is in the late 1900s, and then early 20th century, mid 20th century. Late 1800s, early and mid 1900s is when a lot of these things were put into place. And so I was saying that at the same time that they were building these public housing, specifically Cabrini Green in Chicago, they were simultaneously building suburbs outside of cities. And white flight was taking place within cities, as specifically in Midwestern and West Coast and Eastern cities, as black people were fleeing the terrors that they dealt with in the South and looking for better lives here. They were coming here and being relegated to second-class citizens, substandard living conditions, and they had no true options or no availability to them to get out of this substandard living conditions, because the suburbs had these covenants that were written into them that made it so that even though it was illegal even though that the laws in the Midwest or the laws in the West Coast may not have said specifically black people can't live in this area, the contracts for the home said you cannot sell it to black people. And when black people will begin to move into specific areas, you will see white flight happening in those areas. And so, again, and that's just living conditions. But I think one of the things that's also important to point out is some of the financial hypocrisies that were going on. And so in the passage we just read, we heard about how majority of white, disproportionately white people were given subsidies to begin to go and buy these homes that in the suburbs, and they were able to put down only 10% to go buy these homes that were in the suburbs. And also the people, and this wasn't laid out in here, but the people who were building these homes that were in the suburbs, these houses in the suburbs, were all white. So black people didn't have an opportunity. Black people and people of color did not have an opportunity to get in on the ground floor of owning these homes and build generational wealth through owning these homes and take advantage of this subsidy that was being passed for them to own homes. And then they also didn't have the opportunity to get more employment from these homes being built because they weren't allowed to have these jobs. And then at the same time, there was a stigmatization that was being put towards them having the same type of subsidy granted to them to have public housing. And again, that just a reminder of the type of ideology that has existed in the society and the type of disadvantages and discrimination that people of color have had. And there's no way to really quantify all of these things in present day. It's no way to quantify how many black people and people of color and families of color would have been benefited and would not have had some of the negative aspects of the society inflicted upon them if they would have been able to use these subsidies to buy these homes at such an unprecedented low rate. If they were able to get more employment and build businesses around these homes being constructed. I think another one of the things that's important to point out is the dangers of capitalism and some of the negative connotations that come with capitalism and come with a capitalistic society. And there were people in a country where it's obvious that certain people had more than they needed, were rich and were wealthy, that they didn't want to be bothered to help the people who were disadvantaged, to help these people who were poor. And it's important to point out that it's not simply that somebody who is rich or somebody who's wealthy at this time earned all of these things just through their hard work and through their intellect and their intelligence. Specifically during this time, there was a heavy amount of exploitation that was going on for these people to build this wealth, for these people to get rich. There's an enormous amount of white people who the only reason that they had the type of wealth and the type of financial advantage that they had was because of the free labor market that existed in the society, was because of the lack of equal and livable wages that were being paid out in the society. And so that's the thing that you have to keep in mind when you hear complaints about subsidies or complaints about helping people or money going to people who have less than. It's not simply that these people have less than in our country, in our society, because they don't want to have more, because they have not worked for more. Our country is built on a economic system where exploitation is demanded. So for someone else to be rich, it means someone else has to be poor.